Hello everyone, it's History Behind the Warrior, currently stranded in the astral plane of Havoc's Citadel, coming off the highly anticipated release of MK1's expansion, Khaos Reigns. A DLC narrative that I've been very excited for since the end of the base game story. Hell, this is an expansion I've been waiting all the way back since MK Deception, when Havoc originally debuted 20 years ago. So naturally, I've been eagerly awaiting for this storyline to be adapted, especially with NetherRealm's style of storytelling. So did they achieve that goal? Well, not really. Oh fuck, that's terrible. Why do people drink this? You see, I'm in a very unique position for this DLC and expansion. I'm torn between my love for storytelling, canon, and expansion, whilst also having to be unbelievably aware of the narrative issues surrounding timelines and multiverses. I'm in both a bias and critical position for things I love and things I hate. Because there is a lot, and I mean a lot here to really enjoy, but there's an equal amount of issues at every step that feel very misplaced. Because the DLC, whilst very fun, feels very unfulfilling for me in a lot of areas. Especially that very anticlimactic wrap up at the very end. So if you made it this far already, it should be pretty cut and dry that I'll only be reviewing the story mode. I shan't be covering any of the gameplay changes or game modes, because that all kind of warrants a video in itself. Now, coming off the base story of Mortal Kombat 1, we had an incredibly strong yet flawed opening for this new era, with 2/3 of the story straight up fantastic with how it re-establishes the canon and timeline. Although it isn't entirely perfect, it does do a good job with what it has. Sadly though, a lot of this would wind up being horribly squandered, and more or less completely derailed in the later half for a timeline multiverse story arc, as it attempts to wrap up both the main story and the Aftermath DLC expansion at the same time. It's the old saying of less is more, and it's never been more prevalent for this DLC. However, there are actually elements here that work far better for that of Titan Havoc than they do for Titan Shang Tsung. You see, the mishmash acolytes introduced during the final chapter feel really tailored for Titan Havoc, because naturally, the merged versions of our beloved characters is gonna get the reaction of, what the fuck? And that's great. That's the sort of nightmare fuel that should be tailored towards Khaos. However, such enemy types are not prevalent throughout the DLC, and as such, we're relegated back to the color palette swap of enemies, or even worse here, characters who have no idea what the fuck sun cream is, or look like they've been deep dived in bubblegum. Point is that right out the gate, this DLC had a mountain of a hill to climb up, especially with the multiverse aspects we've come to loathe. But with such a compelling and promising antagonist in the form of Titan fucking Havoc, it really did present an unbridled sea of potential and opportunity here. So, did they capitalize on these elements to make it that special? Well, kind of? Well, again, this is an expansion that is so incredibly divisive to me, with the topics, characters, and elements that it does juggle. So to truly understand what works here and what doesn't work here, let's go through this all chapter by chapter. However, to truly touch on this DLC, we gotta do it right. Now, the opening of the DLC really sets the tone for the rest of the expansion, with a lot of incredibly strong action and a very heavy emphasis on the Lin Kuei, who are essentially the centerpiece of this DLC here, kicking off with an incredible chase sequence between Cyrax and Sector. And it's here where we are introduced to these new timeline depictions and iterations of the characters, now bound to suits of armor instead of being fruit blended into them. And of course, there is the elephant in the room for the gender Ben takes on them. During this entire sequence here, Sector really lays into her new initiate. This gives us all a really good exhibition of the characters. In fact, this entire sequence in itself is more or less designed to reintroduce us to them, with Cyrax acting as this youthful yet woefully naive initiate, one that is willing to do nearly anything to appease her Grand Master. Not like that, get your head out the gutter. While Sector acts as this battle-hardened, gruff, arrogant superior, one where she actually believes herself to be at the same status as Bi-Han. It's also abundantly clear that right out the gate, these two completely detest each other. And credit is given where it's due. The respective actors do an incredible job of embodying these characters. With Sector's defeat and her being incredibly salty about it, the simulation finally ends, with us coming face to face with Sub-Zero, who is still evidently a massive bitter bitch after the events of the base game. Seeking retribution for Kuai Liang's betrayal, the Cryomancer plans for a devastating siege at his brother's wedding, forcing a very reluctant Cyrax to participate in the assault. And I do like that they just straight up lie to her here. They deceive her, playing right into their hand. Although I will say I am not a fan that as soon as she leaves the room, these two begin to unveil their evil master plan. I know it's exposition for the audience here, but it's just so cartoonishly and comically evil. The only thing they're not doing here is rubbing their hands together menacingly. Of course, this does finally take us up to the wedding itself. And for the most part, I do think this entire sequence is pretty excellent. It's very dramatic, it has a nice bit of melodrama sewn into it. I think as opening chapters go, it's very solid. But my biggest takeaway from this chapter is that it felt very short. I don't know if it was just me or how heavily advertised this sequence was, but I definitely expected a little bit more from it. Problems aside, the assault was awesome. It was great to see the debut of Harumi, especially not being shish kebabbed for once. And overall, it's just kind of nice to see all these characters again after the events of the base game. Yet this is where I take issue with the overall narrative here. Everyone feels a little too safe and too protected to retain the status quo, because no one of importance dies and no one suffers from injuries that have a long-term effect. So later on, when someone is introduced that isn't tied to the core narrative of the main cast, you more or less have a sign over their head that says "Dead Man."
I'm in danger!
Touching back on the chapter, I do actually like how the villains win here. And I do like how Cyrax is shoved front and center, and we get a good exhibition of what she's truly capable of. Yet again though, I do kind of take issue with some of the big wins she gets under her belt. Not to say that I can't see her achieving this, I absolutely can. My issue is how the game is supposed to express this narrative that she's this prodigy. Because beyond the simulation we see at the start of the game, we don't really get too much more of her from this point. I think if we had a time skip or fuck it, even a Rocky training montage, it would make these victories feel a little bit more believable and digestible. I like that idea a lot. It's just not expressed well here. With that in mind though, I really like the melodrama between Cyrax and Kuai here, as you get a real sense of the misguidance Cyrax feels, as well as Kuai Liang's own betrayal. It's expressed really well here, and I absolutely love that he pointed at his own fucking scar to really reinforce just how much of a bastard his brother is. So this scene itself is really good, but I definitely took issue with how this shot was arranged, which is a really weird nitpicky asshole thing to say. I know, but hear me out. A large portion of the dialogue and exposition we have here is with Harumi's back turned to Bi-Han. So I was thinking at any point in time holy shit, they're actually gonna do it again. Is this truly a fixed point in time? And then the scene goes on, and the scene goes on, and then the scene goes on, and nothing happens. And when the betrayal is finally revealed, due to Sector being our cameo, she actually leaves our side, having to cross Cyrax, Scorpion, and Harumi to join Bi-Han's side to then go on to fight us. I know, this is me being a nitpicky asshole, I will own that. But with how seamless the Cyrax and Sector transition was at the very start, to then what we have here feels like night and day. So as expected, following the betrayal, Bi-Han is defeated, and then taken to Outworld, but not before we get this wonderful scene between Kuai and Cyrax here. This is definitely a highlight of the DLC for me, because it's this tragic and somber moment between two former allies. One where you feel the weight and time of their friendship diminish. And as atonement for her own sins, she offers her life to Kuai in order to redeem herself. It's a really good scene. Whilst admittedly cheesy because Harumi has Kuai spare Cyrax as a wedding gift, it's a really good moment that ties back to elements of the base game that I really liked. And it also goes to show the significance that Harumi has to Kuai as a character. Cries in Hanzo Hasashi furiously. So, coming into chapter 2, Oh my god, that's the worst one yet. This is where the real meat of the story begins. If chapter 1 was the tone setter, chapter 2 was the blurring horn in your face. As once we enter Outworld to watch Sector and Cyrax stand trial, we do finally have the arrival of Titan Havoc, and the fucking aura of this man is so good. No one else in the MK universe could tear off their head, toss it, put it back on, and go right to Liu Kang's face and go, "Sup, gimme your side piece." And one thing I want to really enforce is that when Havoc is given center stage here to shine, he does it in spades and steals the show. Like the guy who's doing the VA for this, Jacob Carter, he must owe someone rent. And I also want to highlight how well his vernacular is written. It sounds like a really weird thing to say, but for a character like Havoc who is based in anarchy and chaos, it's really articulate, smarmy, and kind of assholey. There's always this sense of malice between each and every single sentence he produces. So of all of the characters they were able to get right and really landed during the DLC, Havoc, bar none, is the top of that list. With the hunts for Geras underway, this does place us in the shoes of Sector. And I gotta be for real, I adore this chapter. It in fact might actually be my favorite chapter of the DLC, because she's such a stuck-up, self-absorbed narcissist that I kinda like her character. That arrogance really isn't misplaced here. I adore how she turns up her nose to everyone, and has this really kind of fun back and forth with Chameleon here. Which also, thank you for making her a relevant character finally. It's been long overdue, so that was nice to have here. All in all, it's a really good, solid chapter here. We get a good amount of fights, drama, and character here, but I wish every chapter was like this throughout the DLC. And of course, as seen from the trailers, it's in this moment of blind rage following Geras' capture, where Bihan is let loose and falls into the Chaos Realm. And this scene is really, really cool. As you know, this arrogant motherfucker thinks he can win this fight, which makes it an absolute shame that we don't actually see it. I would have loved to have seen Bihan's last stand here, to make him swallow that bitter pill that maybe he might not be as good as he thinks he is. Which makes that whole transformation to Noob Saibot a little bit later a question of, was this something truly fated as a bad thing, or simply a blessing in disguise? And what follows after his defeat is something I can only describe as haunting, and one that I dare say captures the darker tones of the 3D MKs, where the barely alive Cryomancer is being dragged through Havoc's citadel, where the hallways are decorated in the numerous decaying corpses of Geras, and the numerous deaths of the Warden Eternal has a lot of implications here, showing that the power and the magic that Havoc possesses transcends even that of immortality itself. He can truly kill the unkillable, for that is the true nature of chaos. It gives you an idea of what is possible here, and all in all, that is fantastic. Of course, to fill in the evil villain quota, the Titan of Chaos does unveil his master plan, to utilize Geras' time crystal in order to harvest the Kamidogu. By doing so, it will allow chaos to transcend on that of a multiversal scale. Thus, no world and no timeline will be safe from his reach. Now again, as you know, I'm not a fan of the multiverse junk, but for the current premise and what it offers for Havoc's character, I think with the current tools we have in play, it really does work with him. Because something like this is 1,000,000% in line with the character. Not whatever this is, but whatever this is. The Cleric of Chaos. I like that, and I am especially a fan that it does put the Kamidogus front and center, as these are things that simply have not been relevant since Mortal Kombat Deception. But that's also kind of the monkey's paw with the Kamidogus. They are inherently MacGuffins. It's always been a part of their core significance. But where I take issue is how they're kind of overlooked for a large portion of the story, only gaining some real significance during the final chapter. I do feel like a lot more could have been done with them here, or at least their significance to have been highlighted. That definitely would have been just as beneficial. Because of the very strange and unorthodox circumstances, we are given the unique team of Kuai Liang, Sector, and Cyrax. And I will say, I do particularly like this team here, as the dynamic presented between all of these three have so much friction between them. It makes for interesting interactions and interesting dialogue here. So it's pretty engaging to say the least, especially when we're taken to the slums of the Chaos Realm. And this place is wonderful. I just love how much character there is in the presentation and design of this place. I only wish we spent more time here because I think it's great. Which then takes us to chapter 3. Oh, why am I doing this? Do it for the bit, Callum. Do it for the bit. And it's here where we truly begin to fall down the path of the timey-wimey stuff. I'm British. Here we encounter a number of different variants. Some friendly and familiar, and some not so friendly, but still very familiar. It's during this chapter where we do encounter a World War II depiction of Johnny Cage. And I will say, from the little time we do have with him, he's quite fun. He definitely pales in comparison to his mainline counterparts, but he is a fun inclusion all the same, taking us to his superiors, Emperor Rain and Empress Tanya. Timeline remnants of a world engulfed by Havoc's madness, and they are excellent. Actually frustratingly so, because why aren't their main timeline counterparts this good? Why don't they have this character development? Now, chapter 3 is extremely conflicting for me, because the characters steering the chapter are great, wonderful even, but it's timeline variants of characters that we already know. So right out the gate, we already know that one of them is going to die here. And it drives me mad here, because these depictions of the characters are so incredibly good, but we know they're temporary. So it's so unbelievably bittersweet, and I am conflicted on so many levels here. I love how it's presented, I love how it's executed, sometimes literally, but I hate that this is the bar this mainline version now has to reach. So it should be pretty needless to say that I really like this depiction of Rain. He's a strong, level-headed leader who's battling Havoc from the shadows, thwarting Havoc's chaos at every turn he can make, even if it is a fruitless endeavor. However, he's not alone in that regard, as his wife Tanya is being held in the Chaosium for entertainment. Understandably, with their options tied, this does take us to the Chaosium, and we get a really sweet battle between Quan Chi, Frost, Li Mei, and Movado. One where Frost finally wins 3 timelines in. I know it sucks that it's taken this long, but it's long overdue. Eventually, Tanya is dragged out, which pulls us into the fray, and it must be said that just this entire set piece in general is great. With how the Chaosium is laid out, it feels very MK9, where the crowd screams for bloodlust and slaughter. They don't care for how the blood is spilled, only that it flows. And it's so goddamn cool. Even if they did pull another Sindel and Shao variant. Please, no more of this, please. This then leads into an absolutely stellar sequence in an ever-revolving labyrinth. It gives the characters a lot to play with in this area, and it's during this chapter where we get a really good gauge of the relationship between Rain and Tanya here. And I gotta say, it's great. Like, genuinely very good, because there's a lot of playful banter where they bounce off each other. The chemistry is undeniable, especially when they wind up killing their rivals. MK couples that murder together stay together, I guess. And here's the thing, I don't particularly like romances in MK. Like, more often than not, they're kind of a miss for me. But this here is really well done and genuinely very sweet. I only wished that this sort of connection and intimacy was reflected between Melina and Tanya in the base game. Like, yes, I know it's taboo, I know they can't like each other in that way, I know there are restrictions, but I had way more investment in this one chapter between the two than I did for the entire base game between these two. I only hope that going forward, if that relationship is to be re-explored again, but maybe they take some notes from here, because I really liked what they did between the two. But of course, we do get the expected death of one of these two, with Rain essentially getting jam sandwiched in the labyrinth. And the way this is done is brutal, and I love it. The self-sacrifice, the reaching hand, the lost cling to life, the look of pain and dread on Tanya's face as she's drenched in her lover's blood. That's awesome. That's MK's dark side and humor. It's really well done, and I do like that it rattles Tanya enough that it kind of drags over into the start of the next chapter. Which does mean, oh boy, God have mercy on my eternal soul, please don't let me die for Monster. That's not good. Now, after the previous 2 chapters, I will say that this one is definitely quite weak in comparison. At least in its opening sequence, as Tanya is kind of grieving, and she doesn't quite have that playful banter to bounce off of Sector here. It would feel really misplaced if that was the case. So everything's pretty straight and narrow, taking us to our first fight here. And I gotta say, I wasn't a big fan of this sequence here. The variants are hideous, which I suppose fits into the whole nature of, ooh, chaos. But there is a rotating hallway sequence that at first is pretty fun, but does go on way longer than it should. Like, I don't know who this is designed to kill, especially when we take into account, you know. So yeah, in terms of opening, not very strong. But the payoff for what follows is pretty fucking cool, because finally, since Armageddon, we do have the canonical return of Orin the Dragon. And this was a real pleasant treat for me, especially as a long-time MK fan. I know, it's nostalgia, but if we're doing stuff from the 3D era, I'm at least glad they're featuring a lot of elements here. Because God knows how many of these characters will come back. And in a downright gorgeous scene, where Tanya uses her telepathy and the background fades to black, we see her communicate to Orin and make an ally in her, showing that whilst this dragon might be on its last legs, she's so bitter and angry at Havoc for restraining her here, that she will assist us in getting out, taking us to Havoc's Citadel. And this place is easily my favorite area of the entire game. But before we progress, we gotta dial things a little bit back here, because behind the scenes there has been this floating subplot between Cyrax and Kuai Liang, where Kuai takes a particularly strange change of character from the base game, as he becomes angry, bitter, and resentful towards Cyrax after what's happened at the wedding, which I will say he's not in the wrong for. I would also be furiously pissed if someone attacked me at my wedding, but it's the way how he continuously dismisses Cyrax that definitely does rub me the wrong way here, as her faith was misguided and weaponized. I know they were looking to lean into more of the Scorpion elements vengeance part of the character here, but I simply don't think that kind of works for Kuai. It creates this conflict that I'm not a really big fan of. And yes, it does find its resolution, which is good, but for the most part, it does kind of feel like melodrama for the sake of melodrama. With us this deep into the Citadel, this does bring us onto our boy, Noob Saibot. Admittedly, this part is really cool. There's this real sense of weight carried in his stride, and it's not used great, because whilst we get this absolute masterclass in action choreography, I am astonished, nay, flabbergasted, nay, some other sort of British remote word, that all it takes to put Kuai down is one really well-placed kick. After all of that, and everything else, he got OTK'd with one well-placed kick. Like, I know they had to have a reason to have Tanya's chapter really kind of be Tanya's chapter, but this here, it kind of makes Kuai look like a bit of a chump. Like, why couldn't we have had him be dragged through one of Bihan's portals here? Have him be restrained and tortured in the emptiness of this void, which then forces Tanya to actually have to rescue Kuai here. And even then, Tanya fighting Kuai feels a bit misplaced. Again, not that I can't see it, but it's beyond the mainline cast of characters. Why isn't it the bitter brother who's furious at his older sibling for having ruined his wedding day? Why is it not the heartbroken lover who has to put him down in order to save his memory? Or the misguided student who is understandably enraged at her former tutor for manipulating her skill? That real lack in sense of attachment is what really hurts it here. I also do find Noob's time as a villain to be insanely short here. Like, it's one fight and then it's done. In my personal opinion, I think we should have beaten him twice here. The first, where he's knocked down and left unconscious, which then forces his Cybot clone to surface from his body and protect what is left, whilst also giving us, the player, another fight for this character. It feels too resolved, too quick and too soon. Like, I feel it makes so much more sense for us to double tap the Grim Reaper of the MK universe. With Havoc's Warden unconscious, this allows Kuai and his team to retrieve Geras, stealing the Kamidogus and taking them to Liu Kang's temple. Thus, the curtain begins to fall on this fruitful DLC, and it feels very rushed. Like, this story feels like it could have benefited from 2 more chapters. With the exorcism of Noob Saibot, which is admittedly pretty cool, because it takes Lu's use of the Kamidogus to actually break Havoc's influence. We do then have the arrival of Titan Havoc here, and we are treated to a very cool scene, where the Cleric of Chaos has his flesh imbued with the Kamidogus. It's great, but why is everyone watching this? Did we learn nothing from Infinity War? With the gems reclaimed, he does begin his master plan at Havoc's gateways, where we do get some fun fights with Kuai Liang and Bi-Han. And it must be said that Bi-Han's a massive bitch here, but not like in a really bad way now. Because this man is so petty and so unhinged to protect his ego that he throws all care aside. And honestly, it's so in line with his character that it kind of comes around to being likable. I know some have some real issues with him not getting a redemption arc here, and I am inclined to agree up to a certain extent, but I am of the belief that sometimes you need a character as awful as Bi-Han that truly believes he's right despite the terrible atrocities he's caused. Because in his mind, he's done no wrong. If anything, he's been wronged. And I like that perspective to his character. I like how solidified he is in being an absolute dick. Admittedly though, I definitely think he could have been given more character and depth here, which is why I believe there should have been another chapter here, with Noobs taking place at the Fire Temple, and then the finale being torn between him and Liu Kang here, because there's a lot of interactions here between the two that are great, and really would have benefited from having an extra chapter to kind of explore that relationship, and how maybe Bi-Han might be too far gone as an individual, even in this perfect vision and era forged by Liu Kang. With the gateways in sight, we have an unfathomably cool shot here, before the fight concludes super duper quick. Like, way too quick. Like, 2 fights later, quick. And that's largely the issue I have with the final chapter here, because it does feel like it's trying to forcibly wrap up its narrative. And the boss fight itself for this DLC isn't great. It does feel like a glorified Invasions boss with a hint of corrupted Shinnok from MKX. I am of the opinion that for this boss fight, much like Shinnok from MKX, if we are indeed using that as a reference point, that upon beating him in the first round, he obtains this new grotesque form, surrounded by the amassed bodies he calls forth. Havoc can drown in the skin and flesh of all of these different versions of himself to become this Lovecraftian horror, a true being of chaos. It is a real shame here because I definitely feel like they could have capitalized on the potential that he presented. Said issues aside though, we do get a pretty badass fight between Noob Saibot and Havoc, with the Chaos Wraith actually winning. And I have seen that online this has been a huge point of contention, asking how a character like Noob of all individuals could defeat a Titan, seeing as, you know, he was defeated in the previous chapter by Tanya. Well, I think I do have some answers to that. The first that does cement the win, or at the very least makes a bit more sense of it, is just how linked Noob Saibot is to Havoc here, understanding his chaos, his magic, and his combat. However, a theory that I have myself and I think is far better is that upon his cleansing at the start of the chapter, Noob absorbed a portion of the Kamidogu's power, making the fight with Havoc more of an even playing field. And also, from a long-term storytelling perspective, actually elevate Noob a little bit higher up on the tier list in that regard. It makes him a Titan level threat without having to fully commit to that title. So this now brings us onto our resolution, and Jesus Christ is it quick, where we see Bi-Han taken to the Temple of Elements for cleansing, Sector travels back to the Lin Kuei to become its new Grand Master, and peace is settled for Kuai and Cyrax. But what became of Titan Havoc and the Multiverse stuff? Honestly, your guess is probably as good as mine at this point, as all plot lines, threads, and ideas are completely dropped. Like, they're not even mentioned in the after credit sequence. They're not even featured in the arcade ladder ending. And it's precisely at this point where the DLC crumbles beneath the grandeur of the weight it carries. If I'm real, a true resolution to this DLC was always going to be difficult. But I feel like this expansion really showed the problems and issues with the new era. There's a lack of focus and direction for what it really wants to be. It's a softcore reboot of the series, whilst also wanting to be a sequel to that of the prior canon, effectively using the multiverse as a way to bridge those two gaps together, which on paper doesn't sound terrible, but in execution isn't fantastic. And I don't entirely blame MK for this direction, because I do think this is a much larger and wider issue with storytelling in general. The overdependence of the multiverse in modern media is what I think is killing the idea. There's such a heavy oversaturation that now everything feels like it needs to tap into it. And because of that, it waters it down and makes it super duper messy. Yeah, there's some certain depictions that do it much better than others, but not everything needs to tackle this subject matter. Especially Mortal Kombat, who already has a plethora of characters so incredibly rich, with a long line and legacy that can be pulled from. So I don't think it's entirely MK's fault, as these stories are in development for years. But I definitely think that the series should stop following trends and instead focus on what made it successful. Nostalgia can only get you so far with this premise here before you get this duality between fans. One that wants something completely new for the series moving forward, and one that inherently wants something quite similar to that of the past. And I think the base story is actually a perfect example of this, because we had all of this time and investment with these new takes on characters for this modern established era, before then the main cast is just tossed aside for a multiverse story. With the DLC, the exact opposite happens in that regard. We're given time and investment with this multiversal world and its characters, for it to then also be cast aside once more. It creates this really jarring disconnect between what we should be invested in, what we can toss aside. It's very discombobulating. And that's what I mean when I say I'm in such a weird place to review this DLC. Because I do think there's genuinely a lot of good here, and there's a lot of elements I really like. The action choreography is easily some of the best the series has ever seen, and the individual character moments in Titan Havoc is fucking amazing, but it's bogged down by its lack of time and investment with its mainline characters here. Had this DLC simply had 2 more chapters, I feel like this would have been perfect. I think that my biggest personal gripe with this DLC is just how safe everyone kind of is. In the larger scope of the narrative with the topics it juggles, there really wasn't any repercussions that haunted the status quo. Why not have it so Smoke is injured during chapter 1, which explains why he's absent for the rest of the DLC? Why not have it so Geras is so damaged by Havoc's procedure that reboots aren't possible anymore? Or better yet, finding out what the hell happened to Titan Havoc. He's ripped apart like tissue here and he's still alive. We don't have a true conclusion and resolution to these characters. And that's where it feels like everyone's a little bit too safe. Like in the after credit sequence, you could have just had a fade to black and just have a Havoc laugh in the background, implying that yeah, he's in the void, but he ain't dead. Now, I know, Mortal Kombat fans, we live in misery. But again, it's not all bad. There are some great emotional bits of story here, with Cyrax being the center of it. She goes through genuinely a very good arc of redemption. Whilst I have my gripes and issues with Kwai, I like his resolution to forgive, forget, and grow, even if it did take the near death of Cyrax to do it. And definitely the emotional highlights for me during this entire expansion was between Emperor Rain and Empress Tanya, as it also allows us to explore the full potential of these characters without having to be tied to the main canon. I only hope that going forward they do take certain elements away from this DLC to allow those characters to grow. Chaos Reigns as a DLC is one of exceedingly strong promise, having wonderful set pieces, great characters, and an incredibly strong main villain. I'm a happy boy in that regard, but I can't dismiss the prevalent issues plaguing the narrative. I think had it taken more time to enrich the narrative with the premise and ideas it brings forth, we absolutely could have had a more fulfilling DLC. I unfortunately feel like what really cripples the narrative is the later half of the expansion, as there is no true conclusion to all of this. I think this is a really fun premise, but it absolutely does die by your own personal feelings on the multiverse. Because if you're not into it, then I absolutely see this as a deal breaker for you. However, if you're kind of in the same camp as me and see how this does benefit the antagonist, some of these issues can be overlooked with the premise it does present. It's just sadly not fully realized here, which is the biggest shame. If I am gonna rank this DLC from 1 to 10 with 5 being just okay, I think it's a 6. It's good, but it's kind of serviceable at best. It's got a lot of great moments that can keep you involved and invested in the Ford, but one that's largely bogged down by its pacing as it largely hinders the experience. Honestly, with the story expansion done and how it wraps itself up, I can't really see them doing much more after this point. At least without fully committing to going full Shao and Onaga plotline, because those are kind of the building blocks left from the events of this story. But even then, I'm quite confident in saying that Onaga kind of deserves his own game. An expansion wouldn't do him justice here. So with that said, this has been it for my DLC expansion and review of Chaos Reigns. And this has been particularly difficult for me to kind of put together, hence why it's come out quite late. I did really want to take the extra time to sit down and kind of review this thing in depth, because this is a DLC and expansion I was very excited to touch on. This handles my favourite antagonist in the series, and whilst I think they did him justice, I found that everything else surrounding this DLC didn't quite meet my expectations. And on the bright side, with Titan Havoc now out the picture, I more or less do believe that this kind of concludes the multiverse aspect of Mortal Kombat 1. So hopefully moving forward we're able to focus on our main core characters, because those are the ones that need the most depth. It's just really beneficial in a long-term storytelling perspective. But before I do send you off, I do want to say thank you for watching this review, and thank you for sticking around as long as you have. I hope you've enjoyed this new format of video, as it's very different from the channel, but it's definitely more me and a direction I want to take the channel in for larger scaled projects. It just allows me to express myself a little bit more, as well as my passion and love for video games. As the next big project that I do plan on covering is MK9, a game of incredible significance for many modern day Mortal Kombat fans. So I am very excited to revisit those older days. So if you're interested in seeing that as well as what goes on behind the scenes, please don't forget to like this video as well as subscribe. And if you wish to be more involved, I do have my socials linked in the description below, as well as my own public Discord. And if you want to go that extra step, we do actually have an official Patreon now, which will essentially be used to fund these larger scale projects. So if you want to show some extra support, that's definitely the place, but the content on the channel will continue to be the same moving forward. For now though, that has been it for me. So as always, stay strong, stay well, and keep on fighting. I'll catch you in the next one.